Hey, everybody, welcome to session 154 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. In this episode, I had a great chat with fellow Auburn University alum, Dr. Alice Shillingsburg. Alice has been doing great work in the field for decades, and if you're not familiar with her, let me read a little bit from her bio. Alice currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Children's Clinical Services and Training at the May Institute. She received her PhD in clinical psych from the aforementioned Auburn University and completed her predoctoral internship and postdoc fellowship at the Marcus Institute. She previously served as the Director of Language and Learning Clinic at the Marcus Autism Center and held an appointment of Associate Professor at Emory University in the Division of Autism and Related Developmental Disabilities. Alice is a licensed psychologist and a BCBAD. She's published over 50 papers and book chapters on interventions for children with autism and related developmental disabilities. She's currently an associate editor for JABA, an editorial board member of Focus on Autism and Other Developmental Disabilities, and is past associate editor for the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. In this episode, we talk about her early experiences in applied behavior analysis, some of our similar experiences that we had at Auburn University. We did not go there at the same time, but had some close enough to where we had some shared classmates and certainly some shared experiences in terms of the climate, faculty, etc. We probably spend the most amount of time talking about clinical leadership at the May Institute and talk a lot about how to make change, particularly at the organizational level, and how to advocate for change in a way that, maximizes the chance of uptake by others whom you're trying to persuade. We also talk a lot about her upcoming talks. Yes, there's two of them at the 2021 Verbal Behavior Conference. We talk about teaching social skills, using speech generation devices, and a whole lot more. So this is a really fun episode, and we cover, as you just heard, quite a bit of territory. So you're going to want to tune into the whole thing, and she concludes with some great advice for the newly minted. As we note during the interview, the Verbal Behavior Conference is coming up right around the corner. So if you do decide to register, use the code podcast10 at checkout to save some money. As we also mentioned towards the end of the show, the May is looking for staff to invest in, as it were. So you can check out the show notes for a link to their current job openings. Just to note, they're not a sponsor of this episode. I just figured I'd throw that in there. But speaking of sponsors, we are brought to you today by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their brand new 8-hour supervision course, as well as their RBT courses over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. We're also brought to you by howtoaba.com. We know that sometimes being a BCBA can be lonely and overwhelming, and at howtoaba.com, they help BCBAs feel supported and confident by providing easy-to-access printable CEUs, all within a collaborative community. So join over 1,000 other ABA professionals over at howtoaba.com, where they'll help you save time, feel confident, and master the field, or master the skills in the field that you love. So for more information, go to howtoaba.com/joinbxresource. And if you do decide to join howtoaba.com, use the code BOP, where, again, you could save some money at checkout. Last but not least, if you are tired of hearing commercials like these, you can go to the Patreon page for the Behavioral Observations podcast. Just go to patreon.com/behavioral observations, or you can just go right to my website, and there'll be a little button at the top that says Patreon. So you can just go to behavioralobservations.com and look for the Patreon tab and click there. Depending on what tier level you can get ad-free podcasts, you can get stickers, you can get access to bonus content that is members only, and a whole lot of other really cool benefits. So if you have a chance to check that out, consider joining it if it's something that you think would be right for you. So I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, Let's get to this great conversation with Dr. Alice Shillingsburg.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Alice Shillingsburg, thanks for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me. What a treat.
The pleasure is certainly mine. I appreciate you joining me this morning. We've got a lot to cover here, so many topics. But before we get into that, I'd love to start with giving you the opportunity to share how you discovered ABA, what made you want to choose as a career path, and certainly we can trace that up, your career arc to kind of what you're doing these days. So if you could lead us off with that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Gosh, when I started in this field, looking into graduate schools and what I was going to do with my life, behavior analysis wasn't super, there weren't a lot of applied behavior analysts. There weren't really a ton of programs. And I think so was drawn to psychology. I knew I wanted to be a practitioner, a clinician. I wanted to work with kids. I didn't know exactly, what type of presentation or challenges, but knew I wanted to do that. And to practice really, kind of clinically, your route really was kind of clinical or counseling psychology type trajectories. So luckily, when I was an undergraduate, I did my undergraduate at Mississippi State University. And who would have thought that Mississippi State would have behaviorally oriented psychology faculty? But I just I guess you probably hear the same story a lot. You just stumble into it, right? You stumbled into your first class. And I found myself in a seminar class for special topics in autism. And as part of that, my very behaviorally oriented faculty, I'm blanking on her name at this point, but we got to learn about LOVAS and got to see some discrete trials and that sort of thing as an undergrad. And at that point, that it just clicked. It made so much sense to me. And so then I started thinking, all right, how do I do this? And clinical child psychology was really the route that I decided to go. And that's a difficult grad program to get into.
For
so
sure.
I, after my undergrad, actually didn't have a grad school to go to just yet. And so I ended up doing a summer research, really a summer day camp for kids with ADHD, with a very behavioral intervention for the summer.
Was this in Mississippi also?
Loved that. No, I actually moved to Buffalo, New York for the summer.
Just a minor change in.
Yeah, not a ton of opportunities in Mississippi for that. So I moved up to Buffalo, spent the summer doing that. Still had some time to kill to get some experience before applying to grad school. And I ended up moving to Maryland, where my older brother lived, and opened up the newspaper at the time, looked in the classifieds.
Because if you're of a certain age, that's what you did. I remember.
Yeah, that's what you did.
There's no monster.com or Upwork or whatever.
Nothing like that. And I cast a net, and I actually got offered two jobs. I wanted to do something with autism. I actually was offered a position at Kennedy Krieger, which I did not take. Interestingly enough, I did get offered a position at an in-home, at the time it was like a UCLA replication site and I had experience with that in my undergrad, and I thought, all right, I'm going to do this. So I spent the next 8 to 10 months getting really well trained in that, lots of experience with young kids with autism. and then applied to grad school and got into Auburn University. And that's where I went to get my PhD in clinical child psychology.
I see. And it's, as a fellow Auburn alumni, I guess we could dispense with the obligatory War Eagle.
War Eagle.
We'll get flack from our classmates if we don't, I suppose. But anyway, so what was it like at Auburn? I think we did not overlap there. I think you arrived a couple years after I had shipped off. So. But I know, just talking to some of our classmates who were there when both of us were there, some of the faculty and things like that, and of course everyone looks back in their kind of grad program sometimes with some nostalgia, sometimes perhaps with some different private events, I suppose, depending on how their grad programs went, but. It's been kind of a consistent theme of Auburn being kind of a special place in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. Can you comment on that? What was your experience like there? And there was such a mix of a lot of different clinical and experimental interests going on at the time. And of course, a lot of our classmates have gone on to do just really amazing things. So, that period of time for me has a special place in my heart. And so I'm just curious to hear your perspective on it.
Yeah. You couldn't have described it better. I think you've heard of the children's novels series of unfortunate events. Mm-hmm. I think of my trajectory as like a series of fortunate events where just one thing after another that just like, when you look back on it, you're like, God, how did that pan out so good? And Auburn was definitely one of those experiences where, I'm a behavior analyst, but I went to a clinical child psychology program and I knew it was behaviorally oriented. Obviously that was why I wanted to go there. But, to arrive and be in a program with this amazing EAB program with these amazing EAB students all in my classes and having these really just invigorating and challenging conversations with a cohort in a completely different same department, but a different track. And to have access to not only faculty who are clinical child psychologists, but to also be taking courses with, Chris Newland and having this experience was just sort of the best of both worlds. And then, a few years into the program, Jim Johnston starts the master's coursework in ABA, which was not in my sequence. I was on the clinical child track, but I absolutely took all those courses. So, I was able to take all of the requisite courses for, to sort of sit for the BCBA, to do that credential as well, as that was becoming more popular and available, while also continuing to pursue my clinical child track. I mean, it was just an outstanding experience and culminated into, I think, for me, a really well-rounded and necessary background to do what I do. And I just couldn't have stumbled into anything better. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting. At least my experience is that they threw all of us experimental folks in with the clinical folks, and we all basically took the same classes for the first year or so, and then after that, we kind of spread out with different electives and whatnot. So we're all kind of receiving the same information and processing it through our different interests and whatnot. But It was definitely just as obviously stimulating time, at least again for me personally. And I've talked a lot about that period of time, especially in the context of how a lot of our classmates really dug into things like behavioral economics and stimulus equivalence and so many other interesting topics that were really picking up steam at that period of time. So who was your major professor at Auburn?
Well, my major professor was Steve Shapiro in the clinical program. He's still there at Auburn.
Very cool. Awesome.
Still highly recommend the program. Really excellent faculty to this day.
You probably already know that Behavior University creates engaging ABA content for new and experienced professionals. Whether it's RBT training or webinars for BACB CEUs, Behavior University has you covered. Behavior University is launching an interactive BACB supervisor training, an innovative approach to supervision training with interactive video to practice decision-making and tools to create a personalized portfolio to take with you when you're done. The course is designed to guide new supervisors through applying the important skills required for effective supervision to their own unique experiences. Behavior University also offers 2 tiers of RBT training. Choose the essentials for the 40-hour course or the premium to add a full kit of study materials and a full-length practice exam. In addition to these features, supervisors can now purchase access to these RBT courses so they can monitor any RBT training for course progress and quiz performance. Supervisors will also receive tools and content to support training of new staff. Users rave about Behavior University RBT training, calling it the clearest instruction, the course that made it stick, amongst other comments. BCBAs say that their staff clearly get it after taking their course. So to check out what they've built and to get podcast-specific discounts, head on over to behavioruniversity.com/observations. Cool. So let's, I guess, wind the clock forward a little bit. So now you are at the May Institute. So tell us a little bit about what you do there. Obviously, the May is kind of a well-known, well-regarded, I guess, mainstay of ABA service delivery that's been around for decades. If you want to talk a little bit about the role the May plays as well, by all means, feel free to do so.
Yeah, sure. So I've been at May Institute now, coming up on my 4th year, so 4 years. And, May Institute has just been around for decades and such a prominent human service delivery organization in the field of ABA. Even just looking back decades of many of the pioneers in our field, being at May Institute, contributing to, the literature from May Institute. So it was a real honor to join May a couple of years ago and just learn so much about lifespan dedication to autism and disabilities. Prior to coming to May, I had been at the Marcus Center in Atlanta, which is part of the Children's Hospital. And, really didn't, not that I wasn't aware or concerned, and certainly worked with families related to transition to adulthood, but it's just been eye-opening to come to a human service organization that really does take this lifespan perspective of caring for individuals with pretty challenging behaviors, intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, autism, into old age. So my role at May Institute, I'm the Senior Vice President of Children's Clinical Services and Training. So I do still focus in the area of children's, which makes sense. And so the bulk of what I do is really focused on clinical training, bringing resources, trainings, broad supervision to the numerous of our sites. We are in several states, working with the directors of different programs, trying to close that research to practice gap, get resources to clinicians and practitioners in a timely way, make sure that there's continuing education, professional development, all of those types of things.
So would you say your role is kind of expanded in the terms of taking a more systems view of intervention? And, we talk a lot on this podcast about how behavior analysts coming right out of school are oftentimes thrust into supervisory positions. And as you get more and more senior, the kind of complexity and the levels, if you will, you just kind of move up that pyramid per se. So I can imagine taking that role at such a large institution that's operating in so many states must have been, I suppose, pretty eye-opening as it relates to just, perhaps a dizzying array of complexities to have to manage.
Yeah. I mean, scale is nothing to disregard. It's tough when you are a large organization with distance and just the number of professionals involved. It's not the kind of program where you can have eyes on every single thing, nor should you have to, really. And I think you're alluding to systems is really important, that it becomes important to have good systems in place, really good processes for providing supports and trainings, and also measuring, metrics, so that we have an idea of, are we up to speed, and what is the, making sure that our quality is hitting where we want it to hit. And it certainly is hard, but absolutely necessary, given the important work that we do. And so I'm very lucky to have a really talented team around me. And we just work together to provide the supports that are needed.
Great. And do you still get a chance to work with clients and consumers? Is that, I know it must be extraordinarily difficult given the layers, I suppose, that we've been kind of talking about. Is that an option for someone at the VP level, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an option. I would say, the last pandemic year has also created a little bit of
that thing, that little
well.
thing, yeah.
That little thing. So, it's funny, if you'd asked me that question, a year or so ago, a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, walking around, sticking your head in, checking out what's going on, was definitely much more a part of it than it is right now. I think, as much as I love working directly with kids, I mean, I'll never get tired of that. I also, think that you have to think about reach and how you can be as effective as possible. And so I do spend I would say the bulk of my time in more coaching and group supervisions and things like that. I miss it sometimes.
Yeah. It makes sense. Obviously, that's what you're. I'm sure that's probably what your role is designated for. But it's just anytime I chat with someone who who's at a particular level with an organization, especially given the large nature of the one that you're working with, it's always something that pops in my mind. So with regard to that, one of the things I want to talk about is, in the correspondence we had leading up to this, we talked about change of various kinds, and so while we're on the topic of these kind of like organizational topics and systems and things like that, can you talk a little bit about how change works at the May in terms of if there's a shift in like kind of a clinical focus or practice and whatnot? I'd like to talk about it at the organizational level. And then I also want to talk about it from like your point of view of clinical practice. But I want to talk about the organizational piece first. So if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, gosh. We're very committed. I mean, I would say personally and for the organization, very committed to innovation and change. I like to say innovation and change together because I think the word change is scary to a lot of people. And if you say innovation with change, people get a little bit more excited about that.
It certainly changes the valence.
Yeah, just a little bit of, a little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down, I guess. Change is hard. It's hard professionally, it's hard personally, it's hard on small scale, and it's certainly hard on a large scale. But change is critical. Sort of what's the point of research, if we're not going to make changes to sort of incorporate some of that or most of that if we can. And so from an organizational standpoint, change, I think, is harder with larger organizations. And I guess I could say that professionally from my own experience, having come from a much smaller organization. You go to a conference, new papers are published, you learn new things. We're incorporating that, pretty quickly. At a larger organization, you do have, I think, much more kind of processing and planning that you have to do to get the good stuff into the hands of the people, that it matters that they have it. And so, that requires lots of trainings, but not just talking at people, working with them, teaching, new repertoires, new procedures. And also, I think, making sure that we're recognizing barriers and working with our teams to reduce those barriers. Not every single thing that you read in the pages of Java can just be, picked up and put over here. Resources are different in different places. Needs, all kinds of things are different. And so I think that requires a different lens to sort of look at what we have available, what's going to fit, what's not going to fit, and how do we make it work. And it definitely takes more than just an idea and inspiration. I mean, it's a lot of working pieces to get that to go.
Hey, everybody. A lot of BCBAs I know struggle with a few things. One of them is just spending too much time scouring the internet and elsewhere for ideas for programming materials and supports. They struggle with finding quality training events and perhaps most importantly, connecting with fellow practitioners. We talk a lot about this on the show, the need to establish community. It's so important to have people you can bounce ideas off of. Well, my friends at howtoaba.com have created a solution for these challenges that so many BCBAs face. The behavior membership program at howtoaba.com provides the following. It's an all-in-one place for ABA resources and materials so practitioners can save time and not reinvent the wheel. It's an online forum where BCBAs can collaborate with a community of other supportive professionals, and they provide access to monthly webinars where practitioners can earn CEUs all throughout the certification cycle. So for more information on the behavior membership program, head over to howtoaba.com. And while you're there, be sure to click the free ABA materials and resources tab to download over 40 free data sheets, visual supports, program descriptions, and more. Again, that's howtoaba.com. Yeah, I can imagine as, perhaps it's like, turning a large ship around and, like an aircraft carrier.
You're not alluding to the Titanic, are you?
No, I was thinking look up maybe like
we're going to make it around any iceberg.
That's right. Or what's that shipping container ship that's been in the news,
Right, in the canal.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not alluding to that. So, what about your clinical approach? Is there something that you've changed your perspective on recently or in the last couple of years? Or is there anything like, you did 10 years ago that you don't do now, or vice versa, or something you thought was crazy that now you think is, maybe a good idea, or something you thought was a good idea that now you think is crazy or whatever? If you can kind of talk a little bit about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, there's a lot of things, I think. And I think that's that, oh gosh, I've shed some practices I think that potentially used to be a go-to. I think that's a good thing, is to not get too ingrained in one particular sort of way of doing things. I mean, interestingly, I would say my early training in discrete trial teaching with kids with autism, I would say, I just loved it so much. I was just absolutely blown away with what we could do in these sessions with these kids and the progress that we could make. But, I was trained in with a bit of a focus in, attention and compliance, and, that these things set the stage for later learning. And it was a couple of years later that I actually, so this would have been, I'm looking at the date, like 20 years ago now, where I went to, and I think you recently had Dr. Carbone on your, on your podcast, but I went to Alabama Association for Behavior Analysis. I think it must have been 2000, maybe 2001. It was a long time ago. And hearing him talk about this child-motivated approach to very intensive teaching. I mean, no difference. It's ABA, it's discrete trial. But at the same time that it was not different, it was completely different. I left that conference. I was a grad student. I just thought, oh my gosh, to have loved something so much, and then now, no, I'm never going to do it that way again, was just amazing to me. So that happened, really early on. And I guess I'm glad that happened, because I sort of learned the value of being open, and not being ashamed of, okay, well, I used to kind of do stuff that way. I don't do it anymore, but that's okay, because now I've got this new information and I'm going to do things slightly differently, and sort of learn from that and grow from that, integrate new approaches into sort of my toolbox of things that I can do. And so, that was probably the first biggest kind of shift in my, kind of clinical approach and clinical thinking. And I'm so lucky for that. I'm still paying off credit cards, though, from traveling all over the country to get as much training as I possibly could in that. So that's one of the benefits now of virtual conferences. All of you listeners, to fly all over the country.
Totally. And we'll get to that in a second, because you've got some talks coming up at the Verbal Behavior Conference we want to talk about,
yes.
as does Dr. Carbone too. So it's definitely, these days it's, continuing ed it's an embarrassment of riches for sure, with all this stuff that's just available, and, from all over the world can attend a Verbal Behavior Conference or whatever state chapter or what have you. So it's really, really, something that is, I think, would be difficult for us to imagine, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, but even recently, though, I mean, that was a pretty big, I think, shift for me early in my career. But even just looking over the last several years, in terms of maybe adopting new practices, I think I've really worked over the last few years to think about how our interventions are experienced from our client's perspective a bit more. I mean, I think I'm a clinician at heart, and, certainly that's the thing that motivates me, is to help others. But, I think in a field where we certainly use a lot of physical guidance, we use a lot of physical prompting, and I think those types of tools certainly can be incredibly valuable, absolutely necessary for learning lots of new skills. But I think that I have really focused a lot recently on thinking and looking for signs from the person that I might be working with for how are they experiencing, the intervention that I'm applying right now. Is this something that they're experiencing positively? Is this, and I think about it that way because I don't think that there's any one particular intervention that I would say, okay, never do that. Because I think some kids, I work mostly with kids, some kids like a lot of structure. They like a lot of guidance and help to get things right. And other kids don't. And so I might make different choices in terms of what types of interventions I'm applying, but really try to think about that from the learner's perspective. Certainly the data, but also I think from being with that person and thinking about how they might be experiencing me and what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Certainly something the field's reflecting on quite a bit these days. It reminds me of a training that practice has been around for a long time, where you get a bunch of people who are new to the human services field, and if one person puts a blindfold on and is like kind of led around or helped around, to kind of get the idea of what it would be like to be supported if you're, vision impaired, or, someone, tries to comb your hair or something like that, and so just get an idea of what it's like on the receiving side of services is, those are obviously very kind of, I guess, blunt examples of self-care, but certainly anything we can do to, continue to develop that perspective sounds certainly worthy. So while we're on this topic of change, and I don't want to forget to come back to the Verbal Behavior Conference, we'll do that in a minute. But while we're on this topic of change, I know in some of the email correspondence that we've had leading up to this, we were talking about like how to make change, how to advocate for change, and you've got some opinions on that I definitely thought that were worth sharing to the audience. So if you could take a minute to elaborate on that, that would be wonderful.
Sure. I think that, like I guess I said a little bit ago, change is hard. I think that, especially if you're the person who probably needs to change, maybe there's new information, new data, something new to our science. The first thing that sort of has to happen is a recognition that I probably shouldn't do it that way anymore, and I think that when you're faced with the possibility of change, you sort of, it sort of implies, well, that way's not right anymore. That's wrong. And I think that that can be really difficult, especially in a field where, clinicians, practitioners, we're in this field because we have gigantic hearts and we want to be in a helping profession. We are driven to help others. And so I think, being faced with information that, okay, this way that perhaps we maybe had done it before isn't necessarily the most acceptable anymore. That can be a hard thing, I think, for people to hear because we're also well-intended. And I think that that's one of the things that I really try to focus on when I'm trying to train teams or practitioners to do things slightly differently or to bring a new practice, is to just be very, very careful about that, the goal really isn't necessarily to say, that's bad, stop doing that, or to make anyone feel that way. It's really just to be insightful and to bring a new practice and try to inspire change. And, I have a saying that if you have something important to say, you should say it in a way that the most people can hear it. And I think that sometimes, sometimes people don't say things as nicely as they could. And that right off the bat sort of closes off half the people who maybe need to hear it. And I think, the thing that motivates me is good services for kids. And so if my goal is really for kids to get the best services that they can possibly get, I want the most people possible to be open to new science, to new procedures, to new practices. So I don't know. I think change is hard, but we can make it harder if we're not sensitive to how hard it can be to change. So I think that's important.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, sometimes we can inadvertently put some barriers to acceptance up by the way in which we try to advocate for things that we feel are right.
Yes, I see that often. I think there's just different ways to do different things, and I think I don't know. I think we should be a little bit nicer.
Okay, last break of this podcast. We are big fans of Greg Hanley's practice group, ftfbc.com, and I just finished the 10-hour course on skills-based treatment and practical functional assessment. I'm in the middle of the one on stereotypy, and they're just brilliant. And I know, I've had a lot of contact with Greg. I'm able to ask him questions and pester him and whatnot, and he's been very generous with his time. But I've nonetheless learned so much in these workshops that are taped. They're on demand. You can access them at any time. They're beautifully shot, too. They're shot by my good friend Ryan O'Donnell at the Daily BA. And, what's interesting about these trainings that you actually feel like you're in the conference room with Greg and his colleagues. They're just it's just top notch. I can't recommend it any higher. If you want to get a discount on these, the best way to do that is to actually sign up for the Behavioral Observations Patreon group. Did you see what I did there? So if you go to patreon.com/behavioral observations and sign up for the early adopter tier or higher, you'll get 20% off of the 3 most popular courses over at FTF Behavioral Consulting. So if you want to check out what they've got going on there and you want to save some money in the process, you can, again, get a discount code over at patreon.com/behavioral observations. And depending on what tier you sign up for, you could get other benefits too, like ad-free podcast feeds, so you don't have to listen to interruptions in the show. You just get right to the conversation with no breaks. Some of the tiers include stickers and other fun things like that. So there's a little bit for everyone at every budget level. So again, check out behavioralobservations.com/Patreon or patreon.com/behavioral observations. Either one will get you where you need to be. All right, let's get back and conclude this fun conversation with Alice. All right, so let's turn to the Verbal Behavior Conference. You have a couple of talks. I'd love to hear. What I don't want you to do is give it away, because we want to entice people to sign up, and we've got links in the show notes with a coupon code to save on your registration. We've got all that fun stuff going on. But the Verbal Behavior Conference is coming up in, I think, about less than 2 weeks, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're on the fence, folks, it's time to hop off, I think. So with that little bit of salesmanship out of the way, let's, why don't you tell us a little bit about the talks that you plan on? What are you talking about at the conference?
Yeah, so I'm giving 2 talks. The first talk is about focusing on social relatedness in our interventions with young children with autism. I would argue, anyone listening, if you work with young kids with autism, you certainly understand the importance of the social impairments and really focusing on building social motivation and having that really be at the foundation of what we're working on. And I'm really going to talk a little bit about some very specific strategies that can really help to build that foundation for practitioners building relationships with the kids that they're working with prior to working on really hard skills. I think if anybody was at the Autism ABAI conference and heard Eileen Schwartz, she said, kids are kids first. I just thought, oh, yes, they are. And we want kids with autism during our interventions to be kids first and to really work on that sort of social connection and social relatedness during our interventions. So that's one presentation that I'm giving. And then the other one is a series of studies that I've conducted looking at teaching verbal behavior skills on kids who are using speech generating devices, which certainly are ubiquitous now. If you're a behavior analyst, you've probably had a kid on your caseload with a speech generating device, and more likely than not, probably have had experience with at least one kiddo who doesn't know how to use it very well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that.
Great. So I've got a question relative to each of those talks. One of them would be, based on your experience and knowledge of literature and things like that, what are some common challenges that practitioners have, whether you're coaching your own teams or what have you? What are some of the barriers to acquiring social skills more generally that you see? And perhaps what are some things for folks to consider? Again, we don't want to give away your talks, but if there's something that you could share with the audience that they could kind of cause them to think a little bit more about what they're doing, or something that they can investigate further, that might be helpful.
Yeah. I won't give anything away. One of the things that I think has probably stood out the most to me with kind of newer BCBAs, master's level BCBAs, is sometimes a little bit of a lack of background in typical child development, which is really important in terms of target selection and good expectations related to skill acquisition. What would be a typical expectation, for this 30-month-old child that you're working with. And so that would actually be something that I think if you are a newer BCBA and you didn't take courses in child development, that could be something to seek out on your own. That's something that as a supervisor, I tend to spend a lot of time talking about what we would typically expect, what would be an expectation in terms of rate of acquisition. Sometimes I think our mastery criteria are pretty stringent. Typical kids maybe couldn't meet that mark, I guess. So, thinking about it that way, that would be something I would suggest.
Yeah, I totally second that. And it's one of those things, until I had my own kids too, it was like, oh, wow, this is, this is, thank goodness they're it's neurotypical as far as I know, but they don't have any developmental challenges, I guess. But that was certainly eye-opening and certainly very, very helpful as a practitioner, and connected some dots. And I did not have a good developmental background, and so I definitely could see where that would be worthwhile to have. All right, so let's talk about the speech generation device. So you kind of alluded to this in talking about your talk, but what do some people get wrong with speech generation devices, or what are some common challenges they have with using them? And I've seen devices of varying levels of complexity, and I've seen someone load up a device with a gazillion different icons that are, way beyond the learner's repertoire and things like that. So those are just some of my own things that I've observed. But it's not something I spend a ton of time with these days. So I'd love to hear, a current perspective on it.
Yeah. There's probably 2 or 3 main things that I guess I could highlight. First, let me just start. I'm not an expert in speech generating devices. And I would say that's probably the first thing is, I think I've been very lucky to have partnered with SLPs that have, had a good relationship with behavior analysis, and that we've worked very collaboratively related to sort of setting up and use of speech generating devices. I think that can really set a nice stage for really successful use. I don't think that a behavior analyst who hasn't had formal training should try to go it alone necessarily. So that's, I think, been helpful for me in the past, at least. I think another thing that I sometimes see, and I think, this varies, but is sort of just thinking, well, if I give him the device, it has all the stuff in it and he'll use it. And we just don't see that, of course. It's not so much that it's this modality that has been missing. You still have to do sort of the same teaching that you would do, whether you're, using sign language or vocal speech or picture exchange, that really good behavioral strategies to teach use of the speech generating device really are necessary. But I certainly have seen speech generating devices be trajectory changing for kids, that once they, were using it, really being able to, it's almost like this cusp where it just opens up so much communication. So I would say, skipping some of the teaching stuff has been challenging. I feel like maybe there's one more point, but it's not coming to me.
That's okay. We'll just tune into your talk to hear more about it.
Okay.
So,
yes, definitely come to the conference. It's
awesome.
An amazing lineup of speakers, honestly.
For sure. I'm looking forward to it. All right. So we're coming up to the end of our time here. So I want to close with the question I love asking the most. So Alice, what advice do you have for the newly minted BCBA?
Oh, goodness. Advice for the newly minted BCBA. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that I have is to not see getting the BCBA as I'm done, but seeing that as I'm starting. I like to encourage newly minted BCBAs to kind of move into their practicing career with a growth mindset that we probably all still need supervision and input and guidance. And I don't know that I have ever worked with a new BCBA that didn't also still need supervision and guidance and input. And to see that as a good thing, not necessarily as I thought I was done, kind of a negative thing. I think that there's just so much to learn, and with each patient or client, with a different set of family values, a different presentation. I mean, we know that kids present differently. There's always room for supervision, always room for peer supervision, and to really seek that out and appreciate it when you get it. I think it's, as I was mentioning, I've learned new things and do things differently just in the last few years. And I've been doing this for 20 something years. So you never really stop learning. So that would be, I think, my advice is to be open to change. That just because you were trained this way in grad school doesn't mean you should be doing it that way 10 years later or even 2 years later.
All right. Makes all the sense in the world to me. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that the may be looking for newly minted BCBAs who could avail themselves to this ongoing mentoring and supervision. So if that assumption's correct.
How did you know? Yes.
We will put a link to that in the show notes as well. So
that'd be great.
People can learn more. All right, cool. This has been a fun conversation, Alice. I appreciate you humoring me with taking a stroll down memory lane from the Auburn days and talking about change and innovation, as well as the stuff that you're talking about at the Verbal Behavior Conference. So thanks so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on. This is great.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.